Yep. Hey, everybody. Welcome to 2023. Can't believe 2022 is over. And welcome to the first Tinderbox meeting of 2023. So thank you very much. We don't have a planned agenda today, so let's just jump right in. For those that are listening for the first time, the way the format works is new people introduce themselves, introduce their challenges, and then we dig into either a scheduled program or we talk about whatever is of interest to the people that have shown up for the day. So it looks like we all have fairly senior people in the community today, so we can just jump right in. And I interrupted the team having an avid conversation about something. So maybe Mark Anderson, you can let us know what that something is.
I'll try and wrap it up. So I will now embarrass my sort of host by saying that I've lifted the edge of the curtain that you and I might be working on something.
No, go ahead.
In the context, but only in the context saying, well, we're writing something, but are we writing a book, or are we writing a hypertext? Because Correct. What I've come to realize is they are fundamentally different approaches. Because if you're going to write a book, you're almost immediately forced down a path. You enforce path of linearization, which we like to call narrative, whether we want it or not. Now, if I'm not writing a hypertext novel and trying to be discursive, but if I'm just writing a book, yeah, that's fine. But actually, a real hypertext, certainly one that is not designed as a literary work, actually doesn't necessarily have an obvious narrative. What it has is links. And so what I've learned from that is circle back to the narrative. If you press too heavily on the narrative to start with, it just makes it incredibly difficult. You basically end up in a version of the old joke about, the design thing about trying to put everything above the fold, and it put, the paper thing, and then it pushes it further down the page and nobody sees it. So, in a version of Doctor, it hurts when I do this, don't do it. Write out the hypertext, put all the bits in there, and then you can go back and if necessary, so triage that structure and say, okay, but I actually do need to have this as my primary structural arc, not so much a narrative, but my structural outline. And so you may move things around. But if they're all linked, that doesn't really matter. And if everything that needs to be self-contained and addressable as a self-contained thing can be that. And this goes back to the thing. So am I more worried about whether the book looks verbose if somebody needs something that they can read as a hypertext in a PDF viewer, or whether it's something that looks like a book? And it's a judgment call. I don't think there's a one size fits all for it, but it's a sort of Rubicon I've crossed in the last year or so of not treating hypertexts like books.
Yes, but when you talk about each individual section, you do want to have each section to have its narrative.
Oh, no, exactly.
To have its narrative, and then you can bump around. It's like choose your own story in some way.
Well, you've just answered my thing. Is you can't mention the word narrative and say, well, it doesn't fit everything without someone saying, but there is a narrative. Well, yes and no, up to a point. And I'm not being totally flippant there. You're right, and things have to have a degree of coherence. But it's more the issue. Something bug go away. It's more the issue that there's a difference between trying to write the grand narrative of your space opera or something, than just providing some sense of coherence to the reader, which is often what narrative means in the more prosaic work sense. So you don't want to suddenly be in something and leap into something totally unconnected,
right?
Though, of course, and this is the really interesting thing about a hypertext, because it's like, there are people who read footnotes and people who don't read footnotes. I'm definitely in the former, unashamedly. And that used to be expensive in print, and which was part of the reason some people really were against it, and they sort of became endnotes because that was cheaper for the publisher. And then endnotes and references started to get all a bit blurred. So it's actually really interesting reading something at the moment that has both. Well, it has its references it has endnotes linked through to references, but it also has in-page footnotes. joy, because the footnotes are those wonderful little excerpts, the little bits of extra color on something. I mean, this is a history of convoying in the Napoleonic Wars, which turns out to be an economic book, not a naval one. But I had that as a reminder of thinking, so if you're writing a hypertext, that's fine. If you need to be able to branch to an exploration, that's really useful, because if you, this is something that informs me when I'm trying to write for ATB Ref, is saying, but if somebody needs to understand this, they need to maybe go to something that takes them in the direction of explaining that, and then possibly being able to explore backwards other things that lie underneath it.
Yeah.
Something that's actually quite difficult to do in terms of export is to sort of, without a massive overhead, build some way of the inlinks and outlinks. But I do feel that at least if something is a discrete note in whatever the eventual output becomes, you've got a much greater chance of somebody being sort of finding it and getting to the point of explanation that they need. The danger is if it's consistently subverted to the sort of cold dead hand of the narrative, the chances are something really important just gets pushed off to the side because it doesn't fit and gets missed.
Yeah.
Chuck.
So professionally, I've dealt with a lot of these issues over a long period of time, and I've seen all the various hyperlink wars and discussions and the various formatting schemes for documents emerge over the last 50 years. And honestly, some problems just remain very difficult to address. And the question of narrative is one of those problems that I think frustrates lots of people, because in some respects, the tools have never emerged to really give both the author and the reader control over the narrative. And that's fundamentally the problem, because the author has a perspective, and the narrative they will gravitate to will reflect that perspective. The reader may share only part of that perspective and may need to navigate the material in a different way.
Mm.
And if I go to ATB Ref as an excellent example, I have multiple uses of ATB Ref, and from what I've seen from everybody else, that's true of just about everyone. Your comment about, well, just open up the entire table of contents for the entire document and do searches on it. That works remarkably well. And so I think, the part of the challenge is, how do we get the tools to better support multiple narratives around the same information? And I think Tinderbox comes closer than anything else I've seen. And yet at the same time, it remains a challenging problem. And so we get into, this constant discussions about, what is the format? Should we use HTML? What else should we use? How do we get from the internal representation of text in a Tinderbox document to an HTML representation? And that winds up being a big part of the conversation and discussion. But then if HTML is such a great solution, I would come back and ask an important question. Why isn't the fundamental text structure in Tinderbox HTML instead of RTF?
Well, I can answer that, and it's accidental.
And maybe it's historical, but it still is an important question.
Okay, so and I'll have to. Mark can thwack me over the head when he's here next, but if he's watched recording, my understanding is so Tinderbox's elder sister, Storyspace, whose roots go probably back as far as the mid '80s, though it didn't see the light of day until about '87 at the first hypertext conference, was designed for making what I would very loosely call a literary hypertext. So these were, this is not shopping lists and things. This is just work, non-linear works of art, small a. And so with that knowledge, that's led. So 2000 was when Tinderbox was written. Mark had written Hypergate before that, which interestingly apparently is the first use of cookie trails, breadcrumb trails, whatever you call them. The sort of the this sort of step down marking we have, which interestingly wasn't to show you where you are. It was to show you if you'd been there before. Was the original concept. Just shows how things don't turn out as you imagine. But so 2000, Mark was interested in blogging and note-taking. Note-taking in the sense, I suppose, the closest covered term I give is so like doing day booking, you know, so you'd write an ongoing, so effectively diarying. And I think those were probably the two driving use cases for Tinderbox when it emerged, originally called Series, as in the Goddess series, in 2000. And you know, the web was still, well, it was kind of new still. It was certainly for the general population, you know, they'd sort of seen all this www stuff and they were just getting there and people getting online. You're absolutely right, I think, to question why HTML. But I'm not sure it's a zero-sum. I'm not so sure it's an unintentional zero-sum question to ask. Could we do something better? Yes. Is it worth the effort? Probably no, given humanity's investment in that. What's really interesting, and linking back to something I said, I think before we started recording, was I've been involved in Future of Text Caucus over the last year, and there's been looking at work in VR, which is something that isn't really being thought about much at the moment, beyond niche things like telesurgery or 3D architectural walkthroughs, but just the likes of us here doing what we do using VR rather than a traditional computer screen. One of the really interesting things about that, and if you think in terms of Tinderbox maps, is the ability to have a limitless map and be really, really wasteful of pixels. So for instance, it's not there now, but if eye tracking gets good enough, for instance, you don't need to have an infinite 4K resolution. You just need to have good resolution where you're looking. And that's basically the shtick that games do in 3D. The bits you're really concentrating on are rendered with much more rigor than the other bits you're not really looking at. And this process led us to talk about, well, how you move information from effectively the actual world to the virtual world. And boy, is it bloodstained. I mean, it's the tools aren't even there yet. So for all the fact that you can go and buy an Oculus and, you know, play disco beat games or something, whoopee. Doing anything really tractable? No, you pretty much have to build it yourself with tools that are incomplete and still being built, which, looking at this audience here, some of you will understand because we go through this with every loop of technology. So it's not surprising. But a really interesting insight was that if you have a document with a DOM in it, you can get a long way very, very fast. Because existing technology, I mean, even things like JavaScript, which you may laugh at, can do an awful lot. I mean, it's an imperfect vessel. And
sorry, what's a DOM? I mean,
document object model. So the easiest way to understand it is if you ever open a web page that you've written by hand. Good example, something you've written by hand, and if you use the browser and right click and say inspect this element, you'll see a beautifully laid out HTML page, which possibly isn't the one you actually wrote, because the browser's clever enough to say, okay, so what this actually means, and it turns it into properly structured object model, so that something like JavaScript say, well, give me the contents of the third child of this node, this sort of thing, which, you know, some of us are akin to doing when we're trying to do, you know, close surgery in a Tinderbox document through action code. So what you have is you have the text, the bit that we think we care about, but we actually have all this other semantics, both the structure in terms of how it all fits together, even if it's just the headings, the styling that we also like to care about is abstracted away because that's done in something like CSS, and you have something that's quite elegant. So, you know, a good case in point to show just how broken a lot of our things are now is, you know, good luck even getting a PDF document made today, 2023, to get a clean extract of the body text of that PDF without things like page numbers and all sorts of other dreck just pumped in because it has no notion of body text because it's printed in PostScript. And PostScript was designed to make sure that what I printed out from my PC was the same as came out from your Amiga or your Mac in 1980 something. It's a quick one, Chuck, because I see Dave has his hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Just very quickly, would you say that a fair comparison of a DOM to this audience would be that a DOM is trying to represent, often after the fact, what the structure of a web page or a series of web pages is, whereas Tinderbox is creating that structure from the beginning and deriving an output, an export of an HTML page based on a similar structure built within Tinderbox itself. That's all part of your notes.
Yes, I mean, in the ideal world, and if you're a real whiz at hypertext, at HTML, they're one and the same thing. So when you export them, you have the DOM and your raw HTML will look the same. I made the point of the difference about the fact that one of the wonders of HTML is it's actually remarkably good at dealing with the fallibilities of humans who either don't know or don't want to know the format, or like me are just completely cack-handed typists and know what they meant to type, and what comes out of my fingers is somewhat different. And it copes remarkably well with all of that. But you actually raise another interesting point. And sorry, I do know Dave has his hand up. Going back to the point of where did Tinderbox start? Originally, Tinderbox just exported the whole document. So basically, you exported and exported the whole thing. But you have to bear in mind this was 2000, and so static hypertext didn't seem remarkably old school. We hadn't quite got to the point of most things like a blog being a database document, a database query. Sorry, should I say? So it wasn't so bizarre at the time. And the sort of things that some of us here are doing where we're writing big reports, I mean, witness the sort of amazing stuff Michael's been doing, is comparatively new, but it just shows the powerful nature of what can be done. Now, in that case, you definitely are doing more of the building structure yourself if you get your template structures done right. And I think an aspect of that, and something that Michael has called out, is that the more structure you put in there, the more you get out of it. Especially if you think of yourself as producing something to be remediated.
And let me pause you there. The more structure you put in, yes, but it's where you put the structure. So I think where a lot of people, and this is I think what Chuck was kind of referring to, the RTF issue too. I mean, going back to my 5 C's of knowledge management, the core fundamental of that, there's some base principles in the idea, but one is repurposability of your content. And to be able to ensure that you can do that, you need to separate your content from as much structure as possible and from as much appearance as possible, so that you have pure content that you then can restructure on the fly however you want. And I think that's really the powerful thing that you want to be able to do. And to your point, Mark, and Tinderbox is uniquely capable of doing that with the ability of having templates and action code and the use of CSS.
Well, and a really interesting example where that plays into the sort of the wonderfully plastic world of sort of all the sort of PKM sectoral, all the noting tools we have around at the moment, is that depending on what you started with, people have very fixed views as to what a note is. So if you think of OPML, which Dave Weiner did, it has no concept of a note text, because the text of the note is the title, because they were just literally lines of text. And you see that reflected in the fact that probably one of the next sort of movements in that arc was Omni Outliner. And Omni Outliner doesn't have a notion of a title. The title, such as it is the first paragraph of the first column of the Omni Outliner. And again, there's no foul in it. There's nothing. No one ever wrote down what these things should be. So Tinderbox has a notion of a note that has separately a title and a text. But for instance, if you were making a document, be it a report output as a single document or just a whole website, there's absolutely nothing that says you have to use the names of your notes at all in the export. And this wraps around when you see people who come from very visually oriented sort of tools that are akin to the Tinderbox map view. And there was a case, someone saying, oh, I don't want this. I don't want a title here. What they wanted was a box on the screen of editable text, because the last tool they used did that. And there's no wrong in that. It's just not happened. It just happens to be not the way that Tinderbox was designed. And retrofitting it to do that would just be expensive and pointless, which probably wasn't the answer the person who wanted, who asked the question that I wanted, but I think is the honest truth.
So let's let Dave comment.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dave's been sitting patiently there.
So several comments, because we've gone far afield. First off, I think your tools on virtual reality, augmented reality are about to accelerate if Apple's product is in fact going to come to market. That will be the big stimulus to improve in that area. And I think when you look at Freeform, I'm trying to imagine Freeform, the free app that's in Ventura, as an augmented reality type of platform. Second, I think the issue of how to get information into that augmented reality, virtual reality space is going to get solved also very quickly with machine learning and just the tools we have today that live in our menu bar, text sniper, where the computer just looks at an image of whatever the document is. It doesn't read the Unicode. It just looks at the image, and from that it can determine what blocks or paragraphs, what's a page number, what's a header, what's a footer, what's a superscript, subscript, and then it can divine all the Unicode from that and create its own readable text. That's essentially what OCR does, sometimes badly. And then finally, regarding what is a book, and there's a whole, obviously, narrative doesn't have a role in something like a reference manual. When you bought back in the day when you could get manuals, you would buy a Hewlett-Packard calculator and you get the handbook, and then you get the reference manual. And the handbook would be the narrative portion where they give you little case studies and examples of what you would want to use this expensive device for and how to do it. And then they would reference the portions of the reference manual that describe in detail, which ATBREF is. I regard ATBREF as strictly a reference manual. There isn't a lot of narrative in there in why you would want to do this. Why would you want to make these notes? That's sort of the realm of case studies, and what each individual case study has a narrative. So I think it's if we don't destroy ourselves in the near future, or if AI doesn't destroy us, it's going to be a very interesting next 30 years with machine learning and what comes out of that, what it allows us to do, and repurposing information.
Well, and on that note, I think what's interesting about Tinderbox is, I don't want to say use it right, but I will, in that I can, and Mark's already started to kind of do this a little bit with the semantic stuff that's going on behind the scenes in Tinderbox. But if you start breaking down your notes into their most atomic level, I could see machine learning working on your Tinderbox file to help you get more insight and knowledge and help it be more predictive in the curation for you and with you. And there'll be a lot of UI and nuance around to help make that happen. But one of the most important things with machine learning, which I often think people don't really think about, is garbage in, garbage out. Like a machine learning only works when you feed it valuable, relevant, information. And I think that's the first step where people often fail in their machine learning and AI efforts, is they don't have access to valuable, clean information to feed the machine.
Well, you don't misunderstand what I'm referring to. I'm talking about machine learning on a very simple problem. It's just having a machine understand what is on a page. What is text? What is a page number? What is a crease from a scan? What is a moth hole? And being able to pull from that image the textual portion of it and not necessarily divining any insight from that, but giving you just the text and understanding that the things that appear to be typographical errors because of low resolution or whatever, it can resolve those things for you. So what you do with the text is up to you, and maybe there's another machine learning algorithm that does literary interpretation for us. That's what Chat GPT does. I'm just talking about a very simple problem of getting information from an analog source, basically a picture of a page. So
perfect. Okay, Mark Anderson, and then maybe we can talk about.
Well, I was going to say I've got some thoughts from what Dave just said, but I'd rather hear from other people. You've heard rather a lot from me already, so perhaps somebody else wants to chime in first.
Well, and I'm more curious: is this the rambling conversation we want to be having, or do we want to talk about a topic too?
No, absolutely. If someone's got a problem, let's for heaven's sake solve that.
Yeah,
Chuck. The world to rise. Chuck.
Okay, I just wanted to circle back on one thing that Mark brought up earlier that I thought was an interesting insight, and it's been rambling around in the back of my mind as well. You were referring, Mark, to virtual reality and the fact that a good virtual reality system, should such a thing ever come into existence, will leverage our natural tendency to focus on a particular area. That when we look at something, we're seeing just the area that we can interpret just the area that's within our foveal region, which is where our eyes put in all the resolution. All the stuff that's peripheral gives us a sense of where we are, of space, and allows us to say, okay, I'm looking at this now, I want to look over there because I think that's where interesting things are happening. But as we look at the knowledge we're trying to deal with, working with Tinderbox, working with any other tool where we're putting information down, we have a similar tendency as human beings. It's not just our visual sense. As human beings, we have a tendency to want to focus in on one area. Yes, we know there are these other things that are related, but to be able to be effective as thinkers or doers or practicers, we have to focus in on a specific thing. And one of the things that I find continually frustrating is the need to focus tightly on, let's say, a particular technical problem I'm working on, even though I know it's just part of a larger piece. But I got to solve, and I got to stay focused on that one thing and not lose the benefit of my focus as I move on to something else. And I just throw out that I hope this virtual reality thinking about how do we direct people's focus expands beyond just a visual orientation and starts to give us tools to allow us to better manage our own thought processes as we go from one area of focus to another area of focus, because that's how the human mind works. And we really need computers to be complementary to the human mind, not alternatives. And boy, do we need more help with thinking as we look at the problems ahead of us. So it's just an observation. And I would just say that one of the reasons why I continue to gravitate toward Tinderbox is very interesting is I think Tinderbox is maybe a prototyping environment for some of these things, a place to learn how to develop focused thought, but not at the expense of being able to integrate that with other activities. Maybe.
I think that's really true, because it's something then recent conversations Michael and I have been having, thinking to writing some stuff about Tinderbox is the sense of our insistence on wanting to do it all in one tool, because hey, it's in front of you, so why shouldn't I use my hammer to drive in screws? I mean, I know there's a screwdriver in the box, but can I be bothered to walk all the way across the room to get it? And it's really interesting. There's a constant sort of repetitive wave of people turning up new in the forum, where basically what they're saying is, where's the answer button? I've tipped all my crap into the bucket. Now where's the answer button? Which is why I'm a bit curmudgeon about things like Zettelkasten, because I think people are misunderstanding what they're doing. It's a wonderful concept, but the insight doesn't come from you pouring enough crap into the right bucket. The insight comes from you actually understanding how you structure the information you've used, which loops back to what you were saying, that I very much accord with the fact that Tinderbox is in many ways unintentionally a prototyping environment.
Absolutely.
The trade-off you make is you definitely do more work to make something that's just a button somewhere else. You build it yourself, but you have the control. And I think for those who engage with it, you have that control because you understand why you wanted it to be that way and not another way. And it might be a bit bloodstained to get it to where you want, but the payoff is that you can do that. I find one of the interesting things in the conversation we're going on with using sort of doing work in VR was I found that there were some really different sort of cohorts in the group. There were people who just wanted basically to read PDFs on a big virtual screen, and there's nothing wrong with that. Whereas my mind was going much more towards the way that, I mean, I don't use map view in Tinderbox very much, and I use it for a very specific thing, which is early stage discovery. And what I describe almost as a jigsaw stage. I tip all the stuff out of the box onto the table. I sort it out, put the corner pieces there, the edge pieces there, sort out the blue bits from the green, the observable patterns. I don't know what they are at that point, but I know that they're not different. And to stick with the jigsaw meme, unless someone's unkindly stolen the piece, I've probably got all the pieces there, just not in the right order yet. And that sort of early stage knowledge discovery is what I use maps for, because I find the moment I need to get anything done at scale and speed, I'm straight back into an outline.
Well, and I
not
think
because I venerated over other things, but simply because I can rapidly move around a large document much more quickly.
Well, and I think what ultimately then, I think a key thing that I would hope people can learn along this process is abstraction. The map view helps you because it helps you crystallize and see it. The second you get to outline, you need to then keep the map in your mind. And what I found over the last couple of years is I can look at my outline and basically, like the Matrix, almost see the map without actually having to see the map. And I think and that becomes especially important when you're thinking in the developing of action code. Right, so that you can say, all right, I see the map, I see this piece of data here, and in order to make this template work, I need this piece of data to move over here, and then I need to decide, do I want that data to move temporarily just for the purpose of performing a calculation, or do I need it to move more persistently for some other structural reason? And it's taken me a couple of years to kind of get my brain to be able to do that and write action code. But it's incredibly useful to do so. I don't know if anybody has any reaction to that. Mark, you seem to be nodding your head.
Yeah, and I see there's a hand up too.
Oh. Well, kind of under the category of all of the above, I do a lot of work in AR and VR. Mostly it's with architectural reconstructions. But I actually find Tinderbox to be very complementary. So the approach I take right now is I'm using 3D modeling as an analytical tool to basically read mostly from textual evidence of buildings that were no longer with us, and then attempt to see if you can actually build it, if the descriptions are correct, or what don't we know. And I'm finding that Tinderbox is a nice parallel with it. Sub discussion that started this whole train of thought with me and kind of anchors into this. I was asked recently by a number of graduate students, we really like Obsidian, what's the difference? And I said, well, I really boiled it down quickly. I said, Obsidian, I think, is a really good note-taking app if your things you want to go look up later and you need to go create a link somewhere. But everything is fairly fixed. The type of links, how you describe them. There are plugins to let you fool around with it. In Tinderbox, much like a 3D analytical model, there is no, it allows you to create structure where there is none. So when we start out with a research problem, we may start with an initial question: did this exist, or is this right or wrong? And I think the great thing about Tinderbox is it has kind of an infinite toolbox to begin to synthesize the response to that question. And so I'm finding that I use 3D modeling and Tinderbox in parallel, pulling off of the data we have. The other interesting thing, which really only applies to my work, is I'm largely focused using an app called Vectorworks for our 3D modeling. You can actually attach data fields. You can attach metadata or any kind of data. I recently discovered, much to my happy surprise, that you can also use links back to your notes in those fields. So I can act, rather than what was always the problem is in the 3D model, we want to describe how we arrived at a particular solution. So here are the fields we had to create, and they were somewhat limited because it's a CAD program. It's not a database, although it is a database. But what I found is I can create a link that goes back to my Tinderbox notes. And so here's the more elaborate explanation as to how we arrived at this. And here's the research behind it. I've also tied it through DevonThink, where I keep all of my research materials. So there's sort of like 3 programs linking back. But what's great about that is I no longer have to try and figure out how to squeeze all that in the 3D models. I'm creating all the links that go back out and allow you to see things. But my final thought on 3D AR, VR, we're finding that there are special cases that VR is extremely useful in reconstructions. If I want to go back to the pyramids, 2,000 years ago and watch them be built, or stand on Mars. But I'd say the vast majority of the work we're doing is all AR. And there's actually a working group at UCLA that is all focused on pedagogy using AR and VR. And almost all of it is focusing on AR, because what we're finding is that we want to augment the experience of a space or a place. We don't want to replace it. So that's just my 2 cents on that. But it's all changing every 5 minutes. So it's all fun.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Wynn, did you have something? Your hand was.
I had my hand up, and then I decided that I'm not sure it was coherent enough to say. There's a bunch of disconnected things. So I realized the other day I did something that I could have done in Tinderbox, and I didn't. But I don't know if it would have worked better. Which is, as you know, I'm sort of planning this computer studio class, and I just had a bunch of things rattling around in my head that I had to organize into a plan of what I'm going to do next. I've got digital notes about all of that stuff that have been accumulating. And what I did was I wrote the very short form, because they're not complicated things, on Post-it notes, and I put them up on my wall, and I rearranged them physically for that. So the interesting thing that in this discussion is, one, that's actually something you can do with Tinderbox that you can't do with a lot of other things. The other is that the physical experience of doing it and being able to step back and look at the blob and step closer to move things around was a different experience than trying to do it on the computer. The computer sort of flattens it too much. And so I felt really good about what I did. I don't know if I would have on the computer. And then the other disconnected part of this is that's an interesting question, possibly for AR/VR systems, of which I have almost no experience, and that all of the experience I do have makes me motion sick, which is a serious problem. Because you could emulate some of this moving around in your space in a way that I think brings a different kind of perception to it than the flatness of the screen. The other example of something with this is when I was editing my collection of poems for publication. I had a big stack of poems and no obvious order for them. So in Scrivener, for those of you familiar with that, or in Tinderbox, I could slide them around on the screen trying to figure it out. What I did was I printed them all out on half sheets of paper on 2-up and cut out all the paper and spread out the paper all over my study, including a phase of literally throwing them up in the air. So I was forced to deal with confronting them in a random order to try to make sense of it, because the order that had been there was sort of biasing things for it. And these are interesting things because they're tasks that we often try to do digitally now, sometimes with good reason and sometimes because we do things digitally. But it's interesting to line them up against each other and think about how the modalities work for different things. As I said, not entirely coherent.
But useful insights.
Well, the AR and the physicality of it. There was just an article about why you get great ideas when you're in the shower. It's like your brain is engaging different circuits, different modes of thought, depending on its where your body is physically located. When we're seated at a screen, there's this habituated, processing of what's going on the screen, and none of that part of our body that we're manipulating at most our finger on a touchpad or a keyboard and a mouse. Whereas when you're standing, you've got your whole kinesthesia sense or whatever, keeping you vertical and upright, and you're physically moving things around. It's engaging other parts of your brain, and there's crosstalk between those. There's different insights and different reactions. So I think augmented reality is going to bring a portion of that, because you'll be able to stand up and carry, have your desk with you wherever you look. I mean, it's going to be an interesting, there may be motion sickness there and context switching, but anyway.
It's interesting. I certainly would admit to being not a great I'm not a VR booster, and indeed I really only have a handset because I was a headset rather. A colleague of mine forced me to have one by giving me one, and then it was churlish to refuse. And the sort of thing I can't get back across is I was amazed by the verisimilitude of things. There are issues to do with focus because you have to use a Fresnel lens. So in a simplistic way, you have to walk to where the focus is. The focus doesn't come to you, which we normally do with our eyes in real life. But I'm sure that will get fixed. And someone's mentioned motion sicknesses, and these things are quite real. I mean, they vary between us. Luckily, I'm not the only person who bounced around at sea long enough that I'm fairly immune to that now. But we're all different in that sense. So a couple of interesting things actually about this is, and sort of looping back. I think Chuck mentioned this idea of having stuff all around and where we focus. An interesting point is, well, it's all very well having VR, but do you actually, I don't think we can see behind our head. So why am I processing this stuff? So in one sense, people get very carried away when they're trying to build VR stuff. We're quite happy with the movie. We know there's nothing behind the saloon front, but that's fine because we get the concept of what's shown. And games understand that. They certainly don't build a whole of the building you're not going to go into, because that's woefully wasteful of processing power. And I think that's something that the sort of fledgling stuff that's going on in terms of general work, as opposed to particular niche things like 3D design and building walkthroughs and things, has yet to do, partly because it's just so insanely difficult. Because first of all, you have to build the environment, then you have to build the chair just so you can go and sit on it in the environment. That's why it's sort of hard. But I'm sure that in a very short order that will get collapsed, and no doubt that if and when Apple bring out their new whizzy thing, that will push things along a bit. But I still think I don't think we've worked out where VR is. And the sad thing is that, one of my colleagues rightly said that this is the last moment where we'll be able to know what it was like before someone said how it is. And that moment for VR is closing very, very fast, and which is why it is interesting to ask about that, because the quite different tribes of what people want to do in terms of working in this extra thing is it that you just want to sit at your desk and have 3 extra screens because you need to see that stuff, and rather than buy 3 extra screens where you might have a headset, or you could sit on a train and have it all in front of you, and these are perfectly sensible things. I certainly would claim I'm much more interested in this exploration thing, so much closer to naive use of Tinderbox maps. And I played around with a thing called Noda, which in a way ends up feeling like Visio in 3D. And one of the first things I did was to take a large data set that I knew was clean because I'd made it, which is basically all the citation tree for 32, 33 odd years of the hypertext conference. And that was important because one of the big problems I found with working data sets that you take from someone else is most of them turn out to be, when you get round the corner, it turns out to be incomplete or just not done or all a mess. And that's difficult when you're also trying to, you're trying to work with the data in a medium you don't understand. What you don't want is the unexpectedness of data that's just dirty and incomplete in a way you don't understand, because you then can't tell if your failure is because you have not done that which you set out to achieve, or just because it's a random error in the data that you can't really see in the moment. But so it's quite interesting. And so I used that Noda, and the interesting thing was I made a big network, referencing network within a sort of conference. And what I realized was I had a 2D map in 3D, and the extra Ds weren't helping any, because I had to walk up to things to read them. And it does cool stuff, like if you look at something that the captions billboards, by which I mean they turn around towards you. So, if they're close enough, you can read them. But what I realized is that in terms of exploration, the extra dimension isn't the release. It's more the scale. And as the tools get better, so you can take, instead of having a 500-piece jigsaw, you can take a 1 million-piece jigsaw potentially and do stuff with it. Do this exploratory work. You've got all this stuff there. You move it around as you need to, and you add structure as you go. Which is why funnily enough, I just still find it easier to do in Tinderbox. I discover I don't need the extra dimension. What I'm actually missing is a bigger virtual screen. And I'll just one other thing was interesting that Dave, you put it neatly in terms of talking about the machine learning. I mean, the bit of machine learning that seems to work, that actually I think works really well, is pattern recognition, image recognition. So that's what's happening in things like Text Sniper. So it's got to a really good level now where it's doing that, it's doing all the OCR. Whereas in terms of our legacy documents, it's like there's a whole area of sort of academic activity that's going into ways to work out OCR errors in PDF documents. That's how screwed up we are. Why not just make clean documents in the first place? I mean, I get it, because some stuff you're never going to do over from source, but nonetheless, I think it's an object lesson to us going forward. Is, well, let's not make that mistake again, because in fairness, PDF was designed for printing. It's false paper, faux paper, so that what prints out of your Mac 2 prints out of my fledgling Amiga. That's what it did, and it still does that. We've pushed it a bit further, of course, in the interim. So, and the challenge to me, it's also interesting in the sort of PKM space in which sort of Tinderbox sorts of it, so the personal knowledge management thing, is that people turning up and saying, well, I've collected all this stuff, and so now what, so I just connect it to whatever the current flavor of AI is, and that's job done. And that's where there's this disconnect, because of course, when you look at the wonders of something like ChatGPT, it's only doing pattern recognition. It has no understanding of why this phrase answers that question. It just knows in its multi-dimensional vector space, whatever it does it, that there's a higher probability of this phrase being relevant to that, to an answer. And for those of us who are more interested in knowledge, i.e., we're not at the start gate of I've just got to assemble the right bits, to get my essay signed off. It doesn't actually offer us much traction. In fact, it makes it worse, because it obfuscates the ambiguities that we're already trying to work against. None of which, lest I sound like a sort of a curmudgeon, makes me not value or be in awe of what's being done. But I do rather worry when the solution becomes, well, let's take everything, put it in the top of the AI hopper, connect the output to the input, crank the handle, and wait till it gets to the end, which is where a lot of our activity, our activity is seemingly at the moment. Because
the answer is 42.
Yeah, absolutely. And worse, the only answer is 42. So you're not even given a probability range. And that serves us badly because, of course, we want to believe. We don't want we want the magic to be real. So we want to believe that it's 42 and not 41 or 43 and a half.
As long as it's in color.
For those of us old enough to remember, yes.
All right. So what other projects have people been working on in Tinderbox? I'm curious about that. Anything new? Anything experimental? What are you trying to get done?
I'll throw out one just little interesting insight. My project is fixing up my house right now, so that's been my big distraction. But Anthony mentioned the architectural aspect of this, and curiously enough, I've been fooling around with reconstructing, reverse engineering my house to figure out where everything is. I've got all this framing and I've got to change some things around, and before I change things around, I sort of need to know what's there and what is in that wall and where are the wires and all the other stuff that you just forget about behind the walls. And so I've been building up a 3D model of my house just to have something to work with, and in the process thinking a lot about how the experience of learning that application compares with the experience I've been having recently of really getting in deep into Tinderbox, and wanting exactly what Anthony brought up, which is, wouldn't it be cool if I could connect a particular piece of my house to a set of notes that I'm thinking about in terms of, where do I want to, put this new thing in my house, and why do I want to put it there, and what are the objectives I'm trying to obtain. And again, it's sort of like two really neat tools. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they could be connected? And so, I just throw that out there, that I think that's, a hopeful, optimistic future, is that I think it's possible to start doing some of that stuff. And I was glad to hear Anthony say he's doing it, because I think it leads to a lot of interesting things.
It does. It's also been useful because, as I like to tell my students, there's no more storage in my head. It's all computational. I don't store anything. That's really kind of true. And so, I'll come back to something I worked on last year. I'll look at it and I'll go, how in the world did I arrive? What's really, really drives me nuts is I put down enough notation to know basically how I did it, but I left one detail out that I now have to reconstruct. And I just find it really useful. I'm curious, what are you using for 3D modeling?
I'm using SketchUp just because it was what my sister-in-law uses, and she's a furniture designer, so I just went along with what she was using.
Sure. Is it the free or the paid version?
I'm paying for it because I'm.
Oh, you might check, because I do think what you want to look for are the features that are around building information management, or BIM.
Yeah.
There probably is a way to put the attached fields to it. That's what I did in Vectorworks. I just simply created a text field and that I could attach to anything, and then basically put in the link going back to Tinderbox as a file link. The one nice thing, I don't know that if SketchUp will do it, but Vectorworks, if you click on the link, it'll actually open up Tinderbox, can take you to the note, which is really nice. So I don't know if SketchUp will do that or not, but it's actually where things are going. It's models used to be the realm of, okay, our project is completed, our research is completed, here's our findings, you can look at it. But much of the work I'm doing now with my colleagues is that when I hand them a model, they're able to see what research went into it, not just the typical references, but here are the 5 versions that failed, and here's the one that was, I think, successful, with the hopes that in the future, as more data becomes available, or some new discovery or whatever, somebody could say, hey, number 2 you abandoned, that was actually more correct than the one you came to. So these models are very dynamic. The kind of the visual of the model is just a result of the data set. And so as the data changes, that changes. And the idea is that it's very portable. But yeah, being able to attach all sorts of data to your model work. The only really tricky thing I found, which I still have a bit of trouble, is you can attach data to anything. So I could attach it to a line, a box, a wall, a window, a group of windows, a group of walls, a site, the whole model, part of the model, half the model. So you have to think about where do you want to put the information you have and how is that best? It's very discoverable by anybody with a model can look it up and see what's in there. But that has actually proved to be kind of daunting. You know, do we want to get down into the sticks and pull the whole thing apart and describe it, or do we just want to say, here's the envelope of this one object, and here's all the data we have about that object? But I don't think you'll run into that with your remodel project, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has been very interesting about the forum, you know, these weekly meetups and things like that, is how much sharing there is of not just how to work with or use Tinderbox, but how to use Tinderbox or other applications. And I just keep finding that the field of things you could add on to, connect Tinderbox to, keeps growing. And again, I find that a hopeful thing. You know, that there's, you know, maybe not in my lifetime, but in perhaps my kids' lifetime, you know, that we'll be able to really start interconnecting all these things, and that's where real value in terms of working in a future life will go.
An interesting thing, thinking of your sort of, you know, design problem and remodeling, is that one of the interesting things you can annotate, and I'm drawing this from, there was a show, I don't know if it got ported over to the States, where this was about people who did self-build. It was called Grand Designs, because normally they were sort of grand failures. But hey, you know, some really interesting things. And anyway, some people got on better with their tradesmen than others, and so on and so forth. But there was one chap, and he was restoring this old factory, but he was on site, and he had basically everywhere you went, if there was a socket that had to go in the wall, there was a little bag, and in the bag was a little bit of paper that said, right, there are 2 screws this size, there are 2, you know. And I'm thinking, actually, you know, that's an interesting way of, and that probably, I heard that, was it BIM or something that that Anthony mentioned, and you know, that's probably in a sense what it's kind of there for. So this bit, this job, here's my manifest, because you could say, well, you could put that anywhere, but sometimes maybe when you're looking at the object, you think, okay, right, and I'm going to need this, and also I also might need to know that this thing is actually, you know, 8 feet up in the air. So I'll not only need a ladder, but I might need someone to sort of stand against the bottom and stop it falling down. All this stuff that you otherwise might not think about, because it's just a socket. So I need a screwdriver and some screws.
I think that we're doing that with ships these days. And in fact, what the augmented reality thing is going to be is that the sailor can be looking at the piece of gear mounted in the bulkhead and have the tech manual right there in front of them, and that part links back to the logistics chain, and he knows whether it's in stores on the ship or he's got to, you know, order it from the beach, and you know, yeah, all that stuff can be connected.
Well, a lot of at least in the 3D modeling, parametric modeling, when that became possible in applications, that changed everything, because let's say 2000, if I drew a wall with some depth to it, it's really just 6 planes that are in relationship to each other. The only reason it's a wall is because I call it a wall, but that's basically all there is to it. In the parametric world, they realized they could create an object, which is really code. It's a little bit like PostScript in a way, would describe something. It's code that basically says, when I draw a wall, it's a wall. And I can say the wall is a stud wall, it has drywall on it, and it's so thick and it's so high. And from that object, that parametric object, can get queried and basically can figure out how much paint you need, how much drywall you need, what are the structural aspects. So the objects themselves become quite sophisticated. And about the same time, people started thinking about, well, can we query this? Can we add data fields to it so that when I finish the design of the building and I hand it to the contractor, they don't pull out their tape measure, which is horrifying to every architect I know, and start measuring the plans to figure out what to do.
Slide rule.
Right, exactly. And you can query it and say, okay, there's going to be, you know, 5,000 feet of drywall you need, and that helped them with bidding. And then the idea was that during each part of the life cycle of the structure, all the way to demolition, including operation, there would be this database that fit around the model. One of the terms that's come up recently is digital twin, which is being kicked around quite a bit about a 3D representation of an actual structure. Well, it can represent other things in a structure, but in the case of architecture, it's a structure, and all the data is there, and you can query it and see what's happening. Many of the larger, more contemporary buildings built in LA, they're all digital twinned with a lot of sophisticated modeling. We, in the academic world, we realized we could co-opt this whole thing, forget how many panes of glass are in the wall. We could attach our own data structure. So if we wanted to know what era, beyond bibliographic, whatever data we wanted, we could attach it to the model. And that's basically why we use BIM. Largely, we don't really use it in the industry standard form, but we use all the data structures. And as the industry has pushed that technology further and further, and it's become more mainstream, it's really benefited to the point that we're now able to create models, put them up on the web, create a walkthrough, allow you to click on a wall and see all the information that went into the construction of that wall, or what we think about reconstruction. So it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and digital twins also too. I mean, if you've got anything, I don't know much you do, but anything mission critical, because in a former life, I was sucked into what now became our aircraft carriers. And when I remember talking about that, having a digital twin. So let's do the operating system upgrade on the digital twin, so that you're not out there in the middle of something exciting and it suddenly says, everything disappears to a dot on the screen. It says, please insert 50p for more missiles. You've got to start all over. You don't want that to happen. So having an external system where you can sort of run out those things, I think, is remarkably interesting. It occurred to me, as people here who probably were around in '84, I have this wonderful thing, which is the Whole Earth Software Guide. Which I bought because I could, and it's rather hard to find now. And actually, funny enough, Bookends ought to be in here, but it isn't, because apparently Bookends came out in '83. But one thing I thought might amuse people here is there's a section called organizing, and I don't know if you can just see at the top it says garbage bags. And I thought this would make the people who make things like Devon think and EndNote rather sad, because that was their category for everything buckets, as we now call them. I thought that was rather fun.
Yes, the 80s were such a simple, wonderful time. For technologists, the 80s are like 50s are for, social organizations.
Well, and it's interesting the change. Dave was mentioning just now about people being on the ship, which is a background we both have in common, and you doing some maintenance of headsets and things. But I remember an engineer colleague of mine saying one of the things he used to do on staff inspections was he'd go into the engineering shop and pull manuals off the shelf and look for the greasy pages, because that indicated what people have been working on, because they're all Diesel-stained pages, where they've been thumbing through the manual to find the page that described the thing had just broken. And that's actually quite interesting, because I know, although Tinderbox has things like the colouring of note icons and things to show the age since last used, but it's still actually remarkably difficult in a digital system to record whether you selected a note just because you say you were scrolling down an outline and you selected the item at the bottom and dragged it to the top, or whether you select it with the intent to read it, or even if you did select it to read it, whether you read it or not. Whereas, funnily enough, the old, it's also in The Name of the Rose, isn't it? In the movie, but the trail of the human hand fat, as they had in the Japanese translations and the manuals, on the page gives you an indication of where people actually went. So that's another interesting challenge for us to have sort of a better handle on, because just touching something in a digital sense doesn't actually give us much of a tellback as to our intent at the time.
More interesting would be how you got to that. If you touched it, where did you come from?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that's interesting. So there's a nice echoing thread there. This thing, and I think it was something that Anthony mentioned. So yes, I did this. I got to here, but I got here by these 6 or 7 failed methods. And actually, it's something that is in my mind when I'm working on ATBRF. At what point do I actually need to take a prosaic description of something and almost turn it into another article to give it room to breathe, to understand that it's not just the description of this label, but it's a description of what lies behind the need to have this thing there at all. And I found as an author that's actually quite difficult, and normally that's generated by someone politely sort of writing in and saying, this is rubbish, I don't understand, or in much more polite terms, and say, oh yeah, actually it doesn't make sense, does it? Right, it needs some more context.
Yeah, that's always the important thing, is the context, but also too, as you're building something, at least in the 3D world, the method in which you built it is somewhat important. Especially if you're, let's say, doing a Gothic reconstruction of a chapel's vaulted ceiling. How you arrived at those arches, there are about 5 different arches that could be derived in different ways that might fit one particular reconstruction. How you chose one particular method to do it and where that came from is important information when sharing with others who are doing similar research, because they can kind of see what your result was. It's also great when you have students who are working on, as I call it, multi-generational, or in our case, multi-quarter projects where your students might change. And so they can open up a file and they can see, oh, this is how this was made. This is where this came from. And it saves a lot of time of repeating, okay, here the source material, here's how we're doing this, here are the 5 arches, here's how you put them together. They can see the result and kind of build off of it. So I think having all that information, and I think I said this back months ago, but I think it's really true, and I kind of said it this morning. The really liberating thing that goes with Tinderbox, just kind of skipping over to that, because I really do think of them as being going hand in hand, at least in my research path, is that it doesn't require anything of me. You know, if I was going to take some data, a data set, and start working with some references and start thinking about things, let's say I want to throw it in, I don't know, FileMaker. I have to think about, does this data fit? What do I have to do? It requires me to start thinking about the structure of the data, and I really don't want to do that. I always start out with a grand vision. Here's what it is. Here's how I'm going to do it. And 5 minutes into the process, like, holy mackerel, here are 10 other things related to it. That's nothing. Where I started was just opening the door. I'm now in a whole nother room in a whole nother building. And so I love the fact that you can just start putting things down. But as you begin to understand that structure and how you want to deal with it, you can then begin to really mold it using prototypes and every other thing in the world. I just love listening to how all of you use it. I don't use it even 1/10 as intensely as the most of you, but where it does shine, it's spectacular. And I don't know of anything else that does this.
Agreed.
I like your point about, you know, the fact that the way I sort of think of what you just described was, it's a bit like, I often think of the notes as a proxy for something in my mind. So here in Meat Space, there's this n-dimensional wonderful, you know, thing going on, but I need to attach an anchor to that so I can make sense of it. So in that sense, just a thing, I know that thing on that side of the map is not the same as this one. The fact that it might just link to an idea at this point, and in a month's time, it might actually be full of all sorts of links and metadata and links up to other programs, is the wonder of incremental formalization. And you absolutely hit the nail on the head. Anything where you've got to sit down and decide that the structure in a complete sort of zero sum to a complete zero sum result is just scary, and I guess it's why I still to this day still don't understand databases. I mean, I have respect for what they do, but for God's sake, don't leave me in charge of one.
They are great. I mean, if anything, sometimes I just start with the timeline. You know, I use Eon timeline. It's great. Just here are the things, put them in order, find out what the context is with the relationship. But you know, even beginning to get in, I'm quite fluent in FileMaker. But even if you had something like, okay, I have a date. Create a date field. Okay. Am I really going to use it like a date? Is it even relevant to what I'm doing? Ultimately, so already I've had like 9 thoughts that I didn't need to have. right? That I can just sit down with Tinderbox. I will have those thoughts in due course when I actually really, okay, it really is a date and I really have to deal with it that way. But I don't want to think about it right then. It's just when something, and dates, of course, just picking on dates. I could have a year, I could have an exact moment, I could have a day, month, year, I could have a month, I could have a circa, all that stuff. I can just put it down and then sort it all out as I go.
It's been fun enough you mentioned dates, because that's again sort of cropped up slightly before. Was the problem between effectively what I suppose I'd describe as historical dates versus sort of calendrical dates. So if I want to know how many working days it was from this time to next time, and somebody else is on Tokyo time and I'm on Johannesburg time, the time zones matter. If I'm looking at something, well, frankly, before 1884, the idea that the time zone should have anything to do with it begins to be somewhat specious, because we didn't have time zones before then. And it's really difficult. I don't know, because it's yet another thing where, depending on your context, you either need, you absolutely need, or you absolutely don't need things. But actually pushing dates into non-date objects turns out to be actually, you just end up with doing a lot of extra work, because then you suddenly find that you just want to know, how long did this person live? I've got to take this thing, turn it into a number just to do some math, and then I've got to put it back again. Whereas it was a date, I could do that. But I don't know if you saw the chap who posted, and I think it's because he'd flown from Singapore to London, and all his research dates were out by 1. And then the penny drops. Yes, because you're about 12 hours out in time zone. And although this is the irony, when you store a date, and many of you here will understand this better than I do, but in a sense, it's a number of milliseconds since a unique epoch, whatever that is, and it's what's stored at the time is the time zone in which you created it, which is fine. But this is where computers set us foul, because then another part of the system thinks, well, you obviously recorded that time zone because it was important. You're thinking, no, it's just happened to be, where it was when I recorded the date that, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I don't think the time zone particularly matters. But you, in the same way, you can't make a date and have it be time zone agnostic. And there's a discussion that's sort of bubbling up slightly, if it hasn't yet, it's sort of been, and certainly in some DMs in the backstage about this, because I don't know whether the natural thing is. The funny thing is, the default at the moment is dates are time zone observant. So if I'm here in UK and I'm going to a meeting in Berlin and I write it in my diary, in my Tinderbox, when I open up Tinderbox in Berlin time, my meeting has moved an hour left, which is not actually what I intended. But I don't know. I've been trying to work out where the divide, if there is one, between things that need to be conscious of that and things that don't exist. Because it seems to me the main thing you need that sort of thing for is either if you're trying to do things like workday durations, or amount of hours and things, or when you want to do concurrent things. We're going to have a Zoom meeting. When is it? But actually that doesn't help, because if I send you it's 8 o'clock, no, it probably does. If I send you it's 8 o'clock my time, when you open it up in your system in a certain time zone, it should be correct. So it's good for that kind of thing. But I suspect that's actually not where most date use of Tinderbox is. So
well, I mean, you raise the issue that time is a local issue, and what is necessary for something like a Zoom or any calendaring system is to understand how to translate a time event into local time. And systems that don't do that lead to confusion, and systems that do that lead to confusion when it isn't relevant. And those of us in the IT space and dealing with infrastructure know there's only one time that matters, and that's UTC. And forget that Greenwich Mean Time stuff. That just That's just the monarchy still trying to maintain their authority.
For those lost, I will point out that UTC and GMT are the same, but we don't say it's a bit like having AD and BC. It's not really correct anymore.
Zulu time.
And the French are still upset that the meridian isn't in Paris. So there we go.
Yes, although when GMT became the thing, the French built an observatory on the meridian line in Brittany, I think, so that their time reference would be to their observatory, even though it was exactly the same.
Yeah, never give in, never surrender.
One of the things is just along these lines for the Times is I've been, for a project, I've been doing a lot of historical work. And so these questions that Anthony was talking about for dates become really relevant, because sometimes you know the date, sometimes you know the month. And I have occasionally mused while I'm on a walk or something about like trying to build a system that would do the best that it could to help you out with your dates, so you could sort of throw your notes in and order them by date as sort of best it can. Because there are sometimes when I don't know which month this happened in, but I do know it happened before this event. And so you can capture that relationship, even if you can't be precise about when any of it happened. And historically speaking, and being able to sort of like just see all the stuff that you've accumulated in your notes about what happened, that would be really useful. But software does not really like that ambiguity.
Sadly, it's now defunct, but similarly Timeline, which was the CCL group, I think it was at MIT. But basically it was written pre-HTML5, and then it was all too difficult to take it forward. And that was really nice. In fact, I used that in a number of projects. In fact, I actually used it for a CV when I went back to study, and people said, "What have you done?" I thought, this is too complicated. And no one wants to know what managerial job. They basically want to know, what have you done? And so I basically did my sort of adult life experience and my sea time, and what systems, when did I start using this type of software, when did I do that, and that was all stranded out in a timeline that I put in a website they go look at. And the nice thing that had was it had a sort of events, basically had a fuzzy 4 item system. So you had a sort of not before, start, end, not after, which it would show. If you populated all those, you'd have a sort of, it's a bit like an error bar, on a whisker chart sort of thing, which I think is actually really interesting, because you're absolutely right, for a lot of things that you either don't know or frankly don't care. Even in the current day, I mean, historically, well, we don't know what day it happened. We might know what year it happened, but even today, you might, maybe often a day or even a month is accurate enough. So the question is then, how do you make a safe default for that? Do you make it the sort of 12 o'clock of the middle day of the month, so that some offset won't just, give you the classic off by 1 problem that will occur without you noticing until it's screwed up all sorts of stuff that you've calculated on top of it. And I'm not sure. It turns up in the forums from time to time, because obviously, especially for people doing historical work, what they don't want, especially if doing calculations based on dates, is to get errors that you don't see in the moment occurring due to the fact that the date object is actually working off a millisecond offset from the epoch, rather than just saying, no, when I said 44 BC, I meant 44 BC,
And it's also really interesting because you can get deductive chains out of that information that you just don't notice in the moment. I might remember that, Bob did this in May of 1945. And so if I find out that something else happened before that event, I can do that. But you may have 5 pieces of information that sort of taken together conclusively prove that A did not happen before B. But those are hard to see unless you are arranging them right in front of yourself. Um, but if you had a nice sort of a date organizer that could take the constraints into effect, some of those things might pop out. And of course, those are just, I think, an interesting kind of historical discovery, because they often tell you something that we didn't otherwise know.
Well, they push close to the present. I mean, there's something I found when I was did my sort of thesis research on because most early hypertext systems were a project that was done, then written up maybe 2 years after the event, but never in a paper would it said, right, we started doing this in 1981, because it might be what it turns up in a conference proceedings in 1984, and trying to work out what was the threading of ideas and what might have sort of cross-pollinated. So this is even in the very recent past. You do want a degree of fuzziness for dates, but I don't think there's yet a nice sort of software solution to it that I've come across.
This actually comes up, it occurs to me, in patent litigation, because the date of invention matters, and dates of publication are relevant, but not necessarily dispositive.
Well, it's that. I mean, so in the sense, it maps to. I think yes, it's prior art, isn't it? So what was around when this was happening? It's not so much is X's thing meaningless because Y was there. It's just knowing that actually, they're probably around at the same time. Because one of the things we do is we tidy up in retrospect, and we love putting hard edges on things. So the number of things that have often emerged several times over roughly the same time, basically the same idea has come out because it was just that idea's time. And we like to say, no, it must be zero sum. X must have been the person because we've somehow worked out that it was the first one.
Well, in a sense, there's a meta issue here that we're talking about, where dates and time are an example of a type of data that can only be understood in context. And in reality, there are lots of information that has that same characteristic. So color, and so those of us who have ever dabbled in photography, yes, I'm looking at you. We realize that color isn't a thing. It's strictly interpretable in a context. What kind of light is shining on it? Is it reflected or generative? There are just so many things. And as we look around the world at the information we're trying to understand and work with, one of the most difficult issues is putting it in context. What does this information mean in context? And just throughout my life, I've just constantly felt like I've run up against this issue of how do we look at that information, not the way necessarily it was collected, but the way it makes sense in terms of what we're doing. And the climate scientists right now are pulling their hair out with this stuff because there are so many complexities in trying to understand the nature of what's going on in the world today. We know we've perturbed it, but how? What led to it? And context is everything. A temperature reading, what does that mean? Are you trying to interpret that in terms of how I'm going to feel? How actually cold it is? When is water going to freeze? Or are you trying to interpret it in terms of impact of climate? And so, again, I think this is just a challenge of working with data and information that all of us have to confront. And time and dates are just one really good example.
Well, context shifts in with time as well, and you see that what you mentioned, invention. People come up with ideas. Lodge invented radio before Marconi did, but Marconi brought it to market, so Marconi's the guy who's credited with inventing it. And if you make the statement that Lodge did it, then people have strong objections to that and write whole books defending Marconi.
Great example of that too is Wallace invented the theory of evolution before Darwin. He did it in New Guinea, and he had actually shared his papers with Darwin before Darwin published. But because Darwin was politically connected and had the money to publish faster, got the attribution for it.
Yeah. So that's another form of context. Is the ENIAC and the von Neumann machine. The two guys invented ENIAC, came up with von Neumann architecture. Von Neumann just got credit for it because he mimeographed off a top secret paper that shouldn't have been distributed. So
pretty funny.
And besides, the Germans had already invented all of the digital computing before ENIAC, and
well, they did it with relays, but I mean,
well,
yeah, some really funky.
we had, yeah, but anyway.
Well, this
Okay,
is the 1940s analog computers they had, yeah.
So we have 1 minute left in today's call. The question is like, what do we want to, let's think about the year. What do we want to accomplish this year, do you think? In terms of our ability to use this tool or related tools and what we're trying to accomplish with our knowledge making?
I'll throw out one idea that I'm trying to wrestle with how to present it in a Tinderbox context. But one of the things that I am beginning to feel very constrained by with Tinderbox is having my Tinderbox application, because Tinderbox is an application building tool at this point, having it interact with the user.
Sorry, I don't understand.
And right.
What does that mean?
Well, if I write a simple program and say to calculate the angles on a triangle, I'd ask someone, give me the A and the B sides of the triangle. How do I do that with Tinderbox and have it give, then turn up the answer? Input from a user while the program is running is
got it.
A bit nebulous.
I think that part of the problem, and this is an interesting thing of sort of, in a sense, drift, and thinking back to the observation really early. So where did it start? So, this is the thing that was effectively a blogging / note-taking device. And now, especially since functions have arrived, it's become, you can almost see, this is the slide, isn't it? The sort of context drift where, so I think what you're alluding to is, well, can I have some sort of bit of UI? And I see the attraction of it. Plus the fact that, or you may ask Tinderbox to do something and effectively it goes into the rule queue. Whereas in your mind's eye, say, no, I asked you this question now, the other stuff can wait. But there isn't a thing that allows you to do that, to say, no, I want this to go in the front of the queue. And it's sort of difficult because I sense that, attractive as that is, given the current affordances of the app, it takes you to a place that's quite differently architected. I'm mindful of somebody, gosh, this was back in the days of about, Tinderbox 4.5, and somebody came to me and what they wanted to do was they wanted to have almost a live simulation. So you change something in Note A and it would trickle across the map in terms of colors and things. And what we actually found that it worked, but it just didn't do it in the milliseconds that their expectation demanded. Because every other thing that he used that was that was designed to do that sort of thing, it was near instantaneous. Whereas what you'd see several rule cycles ripple across. Or you might even have to have sort of clicked onto something and clicked away to refresh, because the design intent at the time of making things like the map wasn't there for that immediate signaling. The bit that's become more immediate, arguably, is the new preview, which now uses WebKit. So whatever it was before, and this is one of the reasons there are all sorts of kind of weirdness to do with previewing, because of the security surrounding using effectively a web browser encapsulated in the app. On the plus side, we just want to throw out some page using all sorts of funky JavaScript to do some clever thing to render it inside the app. The flip side obviously is, well, is that something that, do you know where it came from? Do you want this to happen? Which is difficult, but maybe that might be the avenue to what you're doing. So if you had a page that effectively took inputs, I don't know, Chuck, you probably understand this better than I do.
No, all I want to do was just to throw out the issue, because I think this meetup forum is a good place for people to share their thoughts. I recognize it's a challenging problem for Tinderbox, but I think groupthink could lead us to some interesting ideas. And I really just wanted to put out a topic that I think in 2023 will probably become a little bit more relevant, given the new capabilities of Tinderbox. That's all.
Build have Mark build an agent action that will throw an alert. So you have an agent that scans a particular notes for particular attributes, and when the conditions are met, it sends an alert.
That's actually one of the first things that I ran into that I wanted to be able to do. Yes, but
well, of course,
again, I wasn't trying to get into solving the problem. I was really just trying to say, here's something that I think I'm probably not the only one who will want to do this. And, maybe if we give some thought to it, we can think about what the right way to leverage existing capabilities in Tinderbox, but also, maybe some suggestions for future upgrades.
Well, for historical sort of input, so not coming from a perspective of sort of gainsaying that. I mean, one of the other things that's, this is the reason if you type a query with a single versus a double equals, it still works, because the original concept again was back before AppleScript had been consigned to the naughty step, was that the idea was that you just write action code, you wrote what you needed to do, and Tinderbox would just go figure it out, and it wouldn't have error messages, and it would not have the very sort of interaction that you're quite understandably asking for. Now, and that doesn't gainsay it coming back. But the reason it's not there and has never been there is that the part of the design concept was no. I mean, I know there's that sort of orange error bug, and that's as close as it gets to saying, did you really mean to do this? But things change over time, and I totally agree. There are times where I'd really just like some sort of a both input output signaling, other than by editing a note.
Yeah, the point is, yes, I understand the philosophy that Mark used when designing Tinderbox and not having error messages, but that's different when it's Tinderbox. I'm talking about I've now used Tinderbox to develop an application. I have a different context.
Yeah,
and so I don't think I'm the only one who's going to be running into that.
Yeah, right. And action code is significantly more powerful than it was. I mean, correct. Action code was originally an offshoot of the export code.
Yeah.
In fact, there were three codes. We're going back. There was a separate way you wrote queries, and then action queries are all now action code. And in fact, export code has become a bit of a rump, because by and large, you're just going to write a caret value and stick stuff in, and you do all the calculation in action code. And all the development, so as of about 9, we got functions and all sorts of other really powerful stuff for the niche of people who use it, has come in. The frustrating part is that the reason I mention the lineage is it's kind of a drogue, because if you magically transport back, you said, well, maybe we wouldn't have quite gone down that path, because we'd have had a cleaner way to implement these things. But it is where it is. But I still think it's a really good thing to raise.
Yep. All right. Well, why don't we wrap it up for today? This has been really interesting.
Great way to start the new year.
Good luck for the new year, and we'll see you guys next week. And then, Mr. Anderson, if you have a second, if you can hang on, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll hang on. Yep.
Thanks, you guys. I learned a lot today. And Happy New Year. And Michael, I want to know what you want to get out of 2023.
Well, yeah, actually, before we stop recording, I'll say that. So for me, and I hadn't really crystallized my thoughts here, but for me, I'm doing a number of initiatives, writing my books, writing my papers, finishing my doctorate, writing my articles. And I'd love to find and I'm collaborating a lot more. So I'd love to find a way for Tinderbox to have a more effective way of working with teams, and even if that team is my past and future self. So even if I'm collaborating with myself, I'd like to find and what I mean by more effective, and it might not necessarily be, and to Chuck's point, maybe this is noodling for the community to think about. It may not necessarily be changes necessarily needed in the tool per se, but just how to do it. Like what's the process that you would do to collaborate with self? So, and I experienced this just recently, is I had 450-page report I wrote for a client in one Tinderbox, and then I have my own articles places. And in the client report, I had refined 400, 500 terms and regulatory frameworks that I wanted to get from the client Tinderbox file into mine, because that client one had the more mature thinking. And invariably, what I ended up doing is I created an attribute called source, for lack of a better terminology, pasted those notes over into my file, and then used the column view to see the sources. And then I just kind of manually went through it. And I said, okay, this one's from the client file, so I know that one's updated. I'll delete my old one. And then I was able to then eyeball them a little bit and compare and contrast. And there was a lot of manual work there, but in the end of the day, it took a lot less effort than I thought it was going to take. For 500 terms, I was able to get through it in about 90 minutes. And I was able to really refine and continue my thinking. Do I still want that term? Do I need to relabel that term? And so that kind of collaboration with past and future self I found really effective, but I think there could be better ways to do it. And to what somebody said earlier in the call too, I think it was Anthony, how do I memorialize that so I don't forget and have to remember how I go about doing that? So just that kind of collaboration thing, I think it would be really useful. Then I'd like to see too, just from a tools perspective. So in 9.5, I ran into a bug, which I know Mark is aware of and thinking about, but in the new preview, I'm running into some previewing issues. And when you have really larger documents, it gets challenging with some of these previewing issues. So I'd like to see the preview in some respects for larger documents to become more efficient. And then the one thing I'm really focused on right now too is essentially presenting out of Tinderbox. So, and doing my, especially for the context where I'm actually in control and I don't need to give anybody a PowerPoint file. The last thing I want to do is waste time building a PowerPoint file when I don't need it, when in fact I can just do it all out of Tinderbox. And that's really where I'm. So I've over Christmas, and I think I actually did a presentation on it. Over Christmas, I created a whole new templating structure for basically doing PowerPoint presentations with multimedia in Tinderbox. And so I'd like to see more of that kind of things happen. And that could actually be a really interesting, maybe potentially new view to be added to Tinderbox, which is the slide, if you will. So those are some of the ideas I'm thinking about. It's just a lot of research, a lot of annotation, a lot of provenance of idea. One other area that does come to mind too is thinking about I don't remember who I was doing it with, but if you have, if I've used a term in a particular report, and then and I'm in one Tinderbox file, and now I'm writing a new report, how do I archive the terminology I used in the first report, and then be able to modify it in the new report, and so maintain some history? I think there's some history things to be thinking about there as well. So that's what I'm dealing with.
So I put in I thought I'd add one, and I put it in the chat, but I think one thing is to get hyperbolic view properly polished.
Yes.
At the moment, it's a hint of something really, really powerful, and it's difficult because if you're not used to sort of doing things from a hypertextual perspective, it doesn't make much sense. But actually, with a few extra affordances, hyperbolic view could be a really useful tool, because you can begin to put some semantics into your links and begin to think about how things interconnect. And you can also be in a space where, rather akin to anyone who's used, what's it, Flying Logic, which does a totally different thing, but whereas it draws out the thing for you, you just concentrate on what you want to put in there, and it will lay out, in a sense, the diagram. Because you're not, at this point, you're not worried about aesthetics, you're worried about clarity. And I'm interested in things like, can I look at the network and maybe not show certain link types, or even show things that aren't linked? Because I find in the early stage, I'm often looking for the antimatter so why is there a hole in my map here? There's something that's repelling all these other things. There's a hole there where it shouldn't be. What is it? And it might just be, it boils down to a restatement of something, or the way you refine things. But that, I think, hyperbolic view is much more conducive to that sort of exploration. Although it builds emphatically off links, and what that means is you need to be able to do things like, so at the moment you can have all the links, and you can highlight one type, but in reality, I want to do things like, I want the diagram, but I only want to see the link type that's of interest at the moment.
Yeah.
Because that's also really useful, because if your link type is based on a particular semantic, so you may make multiple links, each of which is encoded with an idea. You might say, oh, wait a minute, that's interesting. So this thing here, which ought to be in the network, has now just dropped off, because when I look at this link, I look at this particular link type, this thing is no longer linked and should be. And it's that kind of really interesting exploratory work that is hinted at the moment by the hyperbolic view, but I think it needs some polish, because, understandably, the main thing that's sort of diverted things of late has been all the enhancements to the preview and the shenanigans that's happened because of the back of house changes with the Apple frameworks.
Yeah, and
that'll need some more settling. That will need to get settled, a bit more before other things go ahead. But I would love to see hyperbolic view swing back into the frame, because when especially if it's more polished, I think more people will begin to see and understand just how powerful and useful it can be for them.
And I guess I think that the preview thing was a necessity because Apple changed something, and so we had to make those fundamental changes.
Correct.
The other thing that comes to mind too is I'd love to find a way potentially to be able to share a Tinderbox file that essentially is read only, right? So that I, as the author, can, so just like I would share a Word file or PDF file that's been read only. So I can say, so that way I don't have to necessarily publish to new formats and all that, and say, here's the file, you can use it, you can read it, but you can't copy it, you can't, edit it and that kind of thing. And I think that would be really, I'd like to find a way to do that.
Well, that was always the push for, Tinderbox for Windows, which hopefully will never happen, because that's just bring a whole scad of new complexities. But it's a problem. So the classic thing, I've done all this, but I'm in a room full of people who've got their corporate Windows computers, and how do I share it with them? Apart from, it has to be said that in principle, HTML could get you there, but I'm conscious of how immature most of the visualization libraries are, in that they can do wonderful things, but only if you are actually a pretty competent programmer or someone comfortable with code and have a mastery of several quite discrete niches. So you need to understand the coding, you need to understand the nature of visual language and design. And that's not where most people are when they're just trying to share, a picture that they can show elegantly in Tinderbox, but they just can't push out to somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, everybody, thanks. Let me go ahead and hit pause on the recording, and so we'll talk to you next week. See ya.